Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's talk about one of the few things in Warhammer 40k that still manages to punch you in the gut, even when you think you've seen it all. In a galaxy where death is expected, where sacrifice is ritual, and where disobedience is worse than heresy, what happens when a regiment of the Astra Militarum looks at a suicide order and simply says no? This isn't just a case of cowardice or confusion. This is defiance, open, unthinkable defiance. In a system built entirely on obedience, on hierarchy, on the belief that even 1,000,000 lives are meaningless compared to one unbroken chain of command. And here's the thing. This kind of rebellion doesn't start with a bolter shot or a shouted insult. Sometimes it begins with silence, with a Vox channel left unanswered, with a colonel staring blankly at an impossible command, with a platoon digging in, not to charge, but to stay. And in that moment, the entire machinery of the Imperium begins to groan in response. Because refusing a suicide order doesn't just challenge a mission, it challenges the very soul of the Imperium. And the consequences, oh, they're never small. Let's break it all down. Because this isn't just about survival, it's about fear, guilt, punishment, and the bitter truth that sometimes in this universe, dying isn't the worst thing that can happen to you. In the grim doctrine of the Astra Militarum, a suicide order isn't some rare, aberrant command. It's policy, it's doctrine carved into stone by men who never see the front lines themselves. And the worst part? It's treated like a normal part of military life. A regiment receiving orders to charge an entrenched, chaos-held position with no armor support and no reinforcements isn't seen as a tragedy. It's seen as a tactical maneuver, the expected cost of doing business in a galaxy where life is cheap and loyalty is demanded in blood. These suicide orders can take many forms. Sometimes it's a frontal assault on a fortified position with nothing but lasguns and bayonets, issued with the full knowledge that not a single guardsman will make it across no man's land. Other times, it's a deployment into a war zone already lost, sending a regiment into the ruins of a hive city swarming with Tyranids or orcs, just to slow the enemy's advance for a few hours. I've even heard of entire regiments being stationed on asteroids infected with Genestealers, not to purge them, but simply to observe the rate of infestation. Observing, knowing full well the fate that awaited them. That's the kind of cold logic the Imperium runs on. The worst part is how institutionalized it all is. These aren't rogue generals losing their minds. Suicide orders come straight from the Departmentum Munitorum, carried on encrypted data slates by adepts in thick parchment robes. The ones who write these orders likely see it as a matter of logistics, just another set of deployment variables in a spreadsheet somewhere. Regiment X will delay the enemy Y for Z hours. Losses, total. Strategic value, acceptable. It's horrific how detached it all becomes, like the human factor has been scrubbed out of the entire process. Political officers, commissars, are the teeth behind these decisions. They're not there to help morale or offer guidance. They're there to enforce obedience at gunpoint. If a commander hesitates, the commissar steps in. If a squad retreats, the commissar pulls the trigger. One shot to the back of the skull, and the rest of the unit gets the message. This isn't a romanticized duty. It's psychological warfare turned inward, a system that eats its own to maintain the illusion of discipline. And the soldiers know this. You can see it in the way they glance over their shoulders whenever a commissar passes by. That quiet fear, that dull acceptance. It's not just the enemy you survive in the guard. It's your own chain of command. Some fans argue that these suicide missions are a kind of dark honor, that in sacrificing themselves, the regiments are upholding the ultimate virtue of the Imperium, duty above life. I used to think that too, that there was something noble in it. But the more I read, the more I saw, the harder it became to justify. These aren't noble deaths. These are wasteful executions dressed up in banners and prayers to the Emperor. And half the time, they don't even work. The enemy isn't slowed, the front isn't stabilized, the mission fails, and all that's left is a crater full of bones and broken lasguns. There's one story that sticks with me. A regiment from the Cadian system before the fall was ordered to hold a bridgehead against a massive chaos push. They were given no armor, no artillery, and their Vox links were cut within the first hour. Still they held. For 4 days. They held because they were Cadians, because they were told to. And because they knew that if they retreated, the commissars behind them would cut them down just as surely as the traitors in front of them. When the final body fell, the brass simply declared the mission a success, then sent the next regiment to take the same ground again, as if the first had never existed. That's what makes these suicide orders so insidious. They're not seen as something to question. They're expected, even applauded. The chain of command doesn't care about victory at all costs. It cares about obedience at all costs. And when the guard follows orders to the death, the machine grinds forward another inch. That's the logic of the Imperium. Sacrifice enough bodies, and eventually you'll build a wall high enough to stop the stars from falling. Of course, not every guardsman accepts this fate blindly, but questioning it, even hesitating for a moment, that's enough to brand you a traitor. That's where the next part of the story begins. When someone finally decides they won't die for a cause that doesn't even remember their name. It's easy to talk about suicide orders like they're just numbers on a parchment scroll, cold and mechanical. But if you've ever read the first-hand accounts, the journals, the Vox recordings that somehow slipped past censors, or even the desperate final messages etched into bunker walls, you start to see something else. You see the people behind those numbers. The men and women who received those orders and still picked up their rifles, even knowing they weren't coming back. The most common reaction, believe it or not, is silence. A kind of quiet, numb acceptance. Not out of bravery or even discipline, but because by the time a guardsman receives a suicide order, they've already lived through so much death that it almost doesn't register. There's one story from a survivor of the Valhalla Ice Stalkers who said that when their commander told them to charge into a Tyranid-infested trench, the regiment didn't even react. No outbursts, no tears. Just a few long exhales and the clatter of boots moving into position, as if they were already ghosts. That's the weight of conditioning, of having the will beaten out of you by years of war and loss. Some guardsmen do crack. You hear about it in the unofficial histories, the kind that circulate on data slates passed hand to hand in quiet corners of transport ships. There was a unit of Talarn desert raiders who, after being ordered to detonate their own munitions cache as a last-ditch attempt to collapse a tunnel network beneath a Necron tomb, simply stopped. They didn't run. They didn't mutiny. They just sat down. One trooper lit a low stick. Another started quietly humming a hymn to the Emperor. The Commissar executed the sergeant on the spot, but even then, the rest didn't move. They had reached their limit, and there was nothing left inside them to obey with. Veterans who survive these kinds of missions rarely talk about them openly. The ones who do always seem off. Not just haunted, but hollowed out, like something essential was burned away in the process. A survivor from the Mordian Iron Guard once described it like this. You don't come back from a suicide mission. Your body might, but your mind never does. It stays in that moment forever, asking why. And that why doesn't get answered, not by the Imperium, not by the commanders, not even by the Emperor they die screaming for. Fan communities have tried to capture this emotional fallout in their art and stories. You'll see beautifully grim dioramas of single survivors kneeling in the mud, surrounded by broken banners and burned-out tank husks, or narrative write-ups where an entire squad dies to hold a bridge for a single fleeing convoy, with the last guardsman triggering a plasma grenade under his own chest plate as enemy forces swarm him. There's this quiet reverence. Like the community is trying to honor something the Imperium never will. The humanity of the Guard. That they felt fear. That they knew it was suicide and still went forward. And not all of them do it for the Emperor. Some march out because they believe they're buying time for someone else, their families, civilians they'll never meet, even rival regiments. That's the part of the Guard that keeps me coming back, honestly. That raw, selfless humanity trapped in a machine that doesn't care if it breaks them. It's easy to label it blind obedience, but when you look closer, it's often a kind of quiet defiance too. A way of saying, if I'm going to die, I'll do it for them, not you. There's this theory some fans have floated around, especially after reading older regimental logs and forbidden letters pulled from destroyed ships. They think some regiments are selected for these suicide missions not because they're expendable, but because they've shown too much spirit. too much independent thinking. It's like punishment disguised as valor. The moment a unit proves it can think for itself, it gets handed a mission no one expects it to survive. A last chance to prove loyalty, or be wiped off the ledger. And when they go through with it, when the order is followed and the bodies are counted, and the report is filed, there's no fanfare, no medals, no memorials, just a line in a transmission. Objective completed. Regiment status consumed. That's all they get. A final footnote in a war with no end. But behind those lines are people, individuals who made a choice, even if that choice was just to keep walking toward certain death. And sometimes, just sometimes, one of them survives. And those are the ones who carry the weight for everyone else. They don't need medals, they carry ghosts. When a regiment refuses a suicide order, it doesn't just challenge the soldiers. It challenges the entire structure of imperial discipline, which in many ways is built on the assumption that obedience is absolute. The Imperium does not tolerate dissent, not from its soldiers, and certainly not from those entrusted with keeping the guard in line. This is where the terrifying, unforgiving machinery of control steps in. And at the heart of that machinery are the Commissars. Commissars are not mere officers. They are the embodiment of imperial will and the enforcers of its darkest laws. When a regiment hesitates, when it dares to question, the Commissar is there to ensure that doubt is crushed immediately. The Commissar's role is not just to lead, but to purge, to remove any trace of weakness, to restore discipline in the harshest possible terms. They are the last line of authority between rebellion and order. And they are terrifyingly efficient in their task. If a commander or a soldier refuses a direct order, especially one as absolute as a suicide mission, then the Commissar steps in, usually without hesitation. Often, it's not about a trial, or even about understanding the reason for refusal. It's about punishment. A refusal to comply is often met with immediate execution, a single bolt round to the back of the head. This is not done in secret, but in full view of the regiment. The Commissar makes sure the soldiers see the blood spilled to remind them of what happens to those who defy the Emperor's will. It's a brutal system, one built on terror, but it's effective. The Commissars know this. They know that fear is the most powerful weapon in the Imperium's arsenal. In fact, it's one of the few things the Guard understands. They don't fear death. They've long since learned that it's inevitable. But they fear the unknown, the uncertainty that comes with disobedience, and more than that, they fear the public consequences of it. So the Commissars keep the soldiers in line by showing them that there is no place for hesitation, no tolerance for failure. And that's where the Tribunals come in. These aren't the kind of courts you'd find in a civilized society. There's no room for defense, no opportunity for a fair hearing. A tribunal in the Astra Militarum is a one-sided affair. The accusation, refusal to comply with orders. The punishment, execution. No questions asked. Even if a soldier has a reason for refusing, it doesn't matter. The tribunal doesn't care about why they did it, only that they failed to follow through. And this isn't just about a single soldier. When one person refuses, it's seen as a failure of the entire unit. It sends the message that maybe, just maybe, the rest of the regiment is thinking too much, questioning too much. And that's a threat the Imperium cannot afford to allow. In extreme cases, entire regiments are wiped out for this. In moments when a unit's refusal becomes public knowledge, when the entire chain of command breaks down, there is no longer room for subtlety. The commanders of those regiments might be executed, but the punishment doesn't end there. In some of the more infamous cases, the punishment is extended to the entire regiment. It's not uncommon for a refusal to result in the mass slaughter of a battalion. The reason? The Imperium cannot afford to let such actions stand as precedent. If word gets out that a regiment can simply refuse a suicide mission, it creates a crack in the wall of fear that holds the entire army together. And if there's one thing that the Imperium fears, it's the breaking of that wall. Fans have speculated that this is one of the reasons why the Astra Militarum is so ruthlessly pragmatic about throwing lives away. It's not just about a soldier's life. It's about ensuring that others understand the cost of disobedience. And the price isn't just a life. It's an entire regiment's existence. The Imperium cannot allow anyone to think they have a choice in matters of life and death. One of the darkest chapters in this kind of discipline comes from the famed story of the Second Cadian Siege. The Second Cadians were known for their resilience, unflinching even when facing the most hopeless odds. But during one particular engagement, their commanders received orders to hold a position against an orc wog that was clearly too strong to be stopped. They knew it was a suicide mission, and when the soldiers realized they had no chance of survival, some of them began to question the validity of the order. That's when the Commissars moved in. Instead of a quick execution, they made an example of the most vocal leaders of dissent. They tied the soldiers to the walls of the fortress they were ordered to hold, facing the incoming orc tide, and left them there to die slowly, publicly, and painfully. The Commissars made sure every soldier saw what happened to those who questioned the Emperor's will. They showed no mercy, not even for the smallest shred of humanity. The orcs did their job, eventually overrunning the position, but not before the soldiers who were left alive understood one unshakable truth. Hesitation was death, and death was the only punishment. These public executions were not only about the traitors who were killed. They were about the message. They were a declaration. No one is safe from this, not even those who have fought for years under the Emperor's banner. This is why the Commissar system exists. This is why these ruthless enforcers of imperial will are so feared. They are not just there to punish, they are there to remind everyone that questioning the Emperor's commands is worse than dying. And in the rare case that a regiment manages to avoid the worst of it, if they somehow survive without disbandment or execution, they are often sent on far more dangerous and degrading missions as punishment. It's a fate worse than death. To be broken down, sent to fight on the front lines of the Imperium's most perilous war zones, where there is no glory, no honor, and no hope of survival. In the end, the refusal is never forgotten. Even if the survivors are exiled to the furthest reaches of space, even if they live out their days fighting on the edges of the Imperium's war effort, their reputation follows them. They are marked as traitors. The fear of such a mark is enough to break anyone, because in the Imperium, the only thing worse than death is being forgotten by it. When an Astra Militarum Regiment openly refuses a suicide order, the consequences don't simply stop at executions or trials. What follows is often far subtler and crueler than the bolt pistol justice delivered by a commissar. The regiment itself doesn't just vanish. Rather, it becomes a ghost, slowly erased piece by piece from imperial history. This punishment, perhaps, is the harshest fate imaginable for soldiers who once fought for the Emperor. They become invisible, forced to live out whatever miserable existence remains in obscurity, disgrace, and despair. The most immediate and common fate of such regiments is disbandment. On the surface, this seems almost mundane. Just another bureaucratic action recorded in dry munitorum logs as nothing more than administrative adjustment. But behind those two sterile words lies a process that's almost painfully vindictive. Soldiers who once fought together as brothers and sisters are deliberately scattered across the Imperium, reassigned individually or in tiny groups to other units. The intention is clear: erase any bonds, break any lingering loyalty, ensure no memory of the regiment's defiance survives. I've always thought it to be an especially cruel irony. The Imperium systematically dismantles the very camaraderie it spent years building up. And for those who are not dispersed, an even darker fate awaits. Some regiments, particularly those infamous for their insubordination, are sent directly to fronts far more desperate than the ones they refused. Officially labeled as penal legions or assigned a number without a name, these units are deliberately deployed to sectors so dangerous that survival becomes nearly impossible. Their stories vanish, their victories unrecorded, their names scrubbed from every official document. They're expected to die quietly, out of sight, away from the heart of the Imperium. The Munitorum calls it redemption through sacrifice, but soldiers who've seen it firsthand call it something simpler: revenge. Fans often speculate about what happens to these regiments in the long term. Lore hints at units such as the Brontian Longknives, who after refusing a catastrophic order on the world of Slado, were sent to the Orphean war zone. Here, isolated and ignored, they fought wave after wave of Necron horrors with no resupply and no relief. Though their bravery in these battles was unquestionable, their deeds remained officially undocumented. Some fragments of Vox recordings that leaked through the fan community suggest they held their ground heroically, desperately radioing for support that never came. Even their victories were painted as failures, their heroism twisted into cowardice, all to ensure their memory would be stained forever. Then there's the fate of forced mergers, a uniquely sinister imperial practice. Some defiant regiments aren't scattered or destroyed outright. Instead, they're forcibly merged with units notorious for brutality, incompetence, or criminality. The goal isn't rehabilitation, it's humiliation. Soldiers who once proudly wore the insignia of honored units find themselves lumped in with criminals and penal conscripts. Veterans who once carried banners emblazoned with proud histories now bear a stigma impossible to erase. The bitterness from such mergers is palpable. Stories circulate of fistfights breaking out in barracks, morale collapsing completely, and an atmosphere of hopelessness descending upon even the bravest of souls. These regiments become a toxic stew, poisoned deliberately by the very leadership that once commanded their obedience. This calculated marginalization is chillingly effective. Regiments subjected to this fate fade into oblivion, becoming mere footnotes in the sprawling bureaucratic logs of the administratum. Even hardcore fans often struggle to piece together fragments of their histories. You have to dive deep into old Imperial armor books, ancient campaign supplements, or obscure fan forums to even find mention of them. It's heartbreaking, really. These were units that once fought, bled, and died for humanity. Now, they're mere whispers in the vast dark of the Imperium's history, ghost regiments cursed to haunt the edges of official lore. Take the story of the Darien 3rd Rifles. After their refusal to conduct a suicidal charge against an Eldar war host on Calthine Prime, the regiment was swiftly reassigned to suppress an uprising on a world already infested by Genestealers. They fought bitterly, heroically, and ultimately hopelessly. Yet when the Munitorum finally logged the outcome, their demise was described simply as a failure of duty. Their heroics erased, their courage disregarded. Such was their punishment, not death itself, but the deliberate denial of dignity in that death. Fan theories suggest that these fates, disbandment, punitive deployment, forced mergers, aren't simply random punishments. They're carefully crafted messages to every regiment in the Astra Militarum. Obey, or this will be you. And it works. Fear spreads like a disease, whispered from soldier to soldier, regiment to regiment. Stories like the Darien 3rd, the Brontian Longknives, or countless unnamed units serve as grim reminders of the consequences awaiting anyone who dares to question orders. Yet, even amid this grim punishment, fans have noted an interesting pattern. Despite the best efforts of the Administratum and Munitorum, these erased regiments sometimes become symbols of quiet resistance among the troops. Whispered legends of their courage and dignity circulate unofficially through barracks, training camps, and trench lines. Soldiers silently honor their memory, despite commissarial orders forbidding it. Tattoos, scratched insignia on flak armor, quiet toasts drunk in hidden corners, small gestures, yes, but powerful. Because, despite every effort to crush their spirit, soldiers of the Astra Militarum still yearn to believe that their lives mean something more than mere fodder. And perhaps this, more than anything else, is what the Imperium fears. That refusal might someday become inspiration, that disobedience might transform into legend. They dread the possibility that the stories they try so desperately to erase might live on, not officially, not loudly, but quietly, in the whispered memories and secret reverence of soldiers who remember. This, in the end, is why the Imperium's punishment is so merciless. It's not just about breaking a regiment, it's about breaking hope itself. Because if hope survives, even in whispers, the Imperium's brutal calculus of obedience might someday unravel entirely. When it comes to dealing with regiments that refuse suicide orders, there's another, less visible layer of cruelty. One that doesn't wear a commissar's peaked cap or carry a bolt pistol, but rather operates silently behind towering stacks of parchment, data slates, and endless columns of dry statistics. This layer is the Adeptus Administratum, and its cold, merciless arm, the Departamento Munitorum. Unlike commissars or frontline commanders, the bureaucrats in these institutions don't see faces or hear voices. They see numbers. To them, a regiment isn't made up of human beings, men and women who suffer, bleed, and hope, but merely assets to be allocated, expended, and replaced as easily as ammunition or spare parts. When one regiment falters or refuses an order, their response isn't anger or outrage. It's a dispassionate stroke of the quill, a swift correction of their ledgers, and a note: asset compromised, immediate replacement required. There's something profoundly chilling in how detached and impersonal this approach is. I remember reading a recovered Munitorum document leaked onto a fan forum years ago. It detailed an incident involving the Castellan 7th Infantry, who refused to assault a Chaos stronghold with almost zero chance of success. The report didn't speak of cowardice or betrayal. It didn't mention bravery or humanity either. Instead, it merely logged the regiment as non-operational, accompanied by an annotation stating losses within acceptable variance, reinforcements dispatched from adjacent sector. As if human lives were simply statistical deviations, easily corrected. To the Administratum and Munitorum, war is arithmetic, a grim equation where casualties are numbers, and victory is measured in statistical efficiency rather than lives saved or valor earned. Fans often joke bitterly that in the Imperium, your worth is calculated down to the fraction. Sadly, that's closer to the truth than anyone wants to admit. Regiments that refuse orders are simply factored out of equations and replaced by others. Planetary tithes are adjusted, and fresh conscripts from distant worlds are swiftly diverted to fill the newly created void. Think about the scale of it. Billions upon billions of lives are drafted into the Astra Militarum every single day. From hive worlds bursting at the seams to agri-worlds stripped bare of able-bodied farmers, the Munitorum's recruiting machine is relentless. A regiment that refuses an order doesn't even cause a ripple in their logistical flow. Instead, it's calmly erased from records, replaced by another newly formed unit whose members likely haven't even fired a lasgun before being hurled into battle. The administrators who orchestrate this endless grinding war machine rarely step foot on the battlefield themselves. They reside safely behind desks, shielded from the horrors they create, surrounded by mountains of parchment, ink, and data slates glowing dimly in candlelit chambers. To them, defiance isn't just undesirable, it's an anomaly that disrupts their perfectly balanced equations of supply and demand, tithe and tribute. They see refusal not as a human reaction to an impossible order, but merely as a variable needing correction. This bureaucratic indifference is best exemplified by how quickly a regiment's existence can be expunged from official records. The Grendoran 5th Heavy Infantry, for instance, famously refused an assault on a heavily fortified Eldar stronghold, arguing that it would lead to pointless slaughter. Within hours, the Munitorum scribes updated their ledgers. The regiment was officially recorded as lost to enemy action, despite their survival at the time of documentation. Any supplies, reinforcements, or communications intended for them were immediately rerouted. Officially, they ceased to exist the moment their refusal was recorded, doomed to die forgotten on a distant battlefield, abandoned by the very empire they served. Fans frequently speculate that these administrators, these faceless bureaucrats, are perhaps the true villains of the Imperium. While Commissars deliver swift, violent punishment, they at least face the soldiers whose fate they decide. The administrators, by contrast, never even glimpse the men and women they sentence to death. For them, wars are fought on paper, their casualties recorded in neat rows and columns, sanitized of all suffering and bravery. They've turned humanity itself into another expendable resource, easily replaceable and disturbingly disposable. There's a grim fan theory I've come across more than once that suggests these bureaucrats deliberately orchestrate suicide orders to manage imperial population levels. It's a deeply cynical view, but not entirely implausible given the sheer callousness of imperial policy. Worlds overflowing with potential conscripts are often the first to be stripped bare, their populations fed directly into the meat grinder. Refusal of suicide orders, from this perspective, isn't a moral stance. It's an irritating logistical anomaly that must be swiftly corrected. Soldiers aren't people, they're units of inventory, and defective inventory must be discarded and replaced. This cold logic extends beyond individual regiments. Entire planets have been sanctioned and heavily tithed as punishment for supplying unreliable troops. When the Cardonian 12th Armored Regiment refused to enter a warp-infested area without adequate psychic support, their entire home planet's tithe was doubled the following year. Countless additional conscripts were forced into service to compensate for the regiment's failure. The Administratum's logic was starkly simple: punish not only the unit, but also the world that produced it. This ruthless efficiency ensures that every world knows the price of hesitation. And perhaps this is the darkest realization, that the Munitorum and Administratum thrive precisely because of their detachment. Their cruelty doesn't stem from malice, but from a horrifying absence of empathy, a complete inability to recognize the humanity behind their ledgers. Soldiers become merely ink on parchment, lives reduced to logistical entries. This cold efficiency is the Imperium's greatest strength and its deepest moral failing. The brutal irony of it all is that the Imperium functions precisely because it refuses to acknowledge the worth of the individual. It exists on sacrifice measured in statistics, courage reduced to numerical data, and humanity itself quantified. When regiments refuse to comply, they aren't challenging orders. They're challenging the very system that sees them only as disposable numbers. And in the eyes of the Administratum, that is perhaps the greatest heresy of all. Despite the Imperium's ruthless machinery, its absolute intolerance for disobedience, and the unyielding brutality of its discipline, fans love to whisper about those rare, almost mythical moments when refusal didn't end in destruction, when defiance became legend rather than disgrace. Of course, these stories are few and far between, whispered cautiously among enthusiasts in quiet corners of fan forums or shared in late-night gatherings at conventions. They're always unofficial, never recognized by the Imperium itself, but they persist precisely because they offer something desperately rare in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium: hope. One of the most beloved and contested fan legends is that of the Tenothian 89th Regiment. According to scattered accounts, they were ordered into a frontal assault against Chaos fortifications during the Nightfall Crusade. The odds weren't just stacked against them, they were astronomical. The regiment, realizing the futility of the assault, openly refused. Instead of immediate destruction, however, something remarkable happened. An Inquisitor, so the story goes, intervened personally. He overrode local commissars, countermanded the suicidal orders, and even praised the regiment's commander, Colonel Eldrick Thorne, for having the courage to prioritize strategic insight over blind obedience. Rather than punishing them, the Inquisition reassigned the regiment to a critical defensive position, where their presence decisively swung the outcome of the campaign. Many fans argue whether this event actually happened, or if it's just wishful thinking. But the story's appeal is undeniable. Fans love the idea of a cold, calculating Inquisitor recognizing humanity's value, even briefly. Then there's the widely shared but officially discredited account of the Drammorian Guard. Posted originally as a short story on an obscure fan site, it describes a regiment given the impossible order to engage an Orc Wach without air or artillery support. According to the legend, Colonel Lena Drexler didn't merely refuse, she openly mocked the strategic incompetence of her superiors over an open Vox channel. Fans affectionately refer to her as Colonel Mockery. And, though official Imperial records completely deny her existence, there are scattered fragments of intercepted Vox logs that seem suspiciously genuine. Remarkably, after Drexler's defiant stand, an influential rogue trader took notice. Impressed by the regiment's courage and willingness to stand firm against incompetence, he requisitioned them for his private fleet, where the Drammorian Guard reportedly served honorably, their story immortalized among the crew as an example of courage overcoming bureaucracy. Another fan favorite involves the infamous events on Terrace Prime, where the Ironsides, the planet's own guard regiment, famously refused a suicide order during a devastating Tyranid invasion. As the legend goes, when commanded to engage directly with the swarm head-on, the regiment's commanding officer calmly refused. Instead, they organized a meticulously planned fighting retreat, saving millions of civilians and preserving significant strategic assets. Rather than execution or censure, the Ironsides were quietly reassigned by Sector Command to the defense of a major forge world, where they distinguished themselves in subsequent battles. Many fans speculate this event was quietly covered up, because publicizing it might inspire further defiance. Yet, snippets of it remain whispered about by guardsmen and fans alike, a subtle rebellion against the idea that obedience must always come before wisdom. A particularly intriguing tale centers around the shadowy figure of Commissar Victor Callus. According to rumors, during the siege of Hive Chiral, Callus himself countermanded a suicidal frontal charge against deeply entrenched heretics, sparing thousands of lives. This alone was unheard of, a commissar choosing reason over rigid dogma. Instead of immediate punishment, Callus was mysteriously promoted and reassigned, vanishing from all public records shortly thereafter. Many fans theorize that Callus was inducted into the Inquisition, his defiance quietly rewarded with a position of secret authority. Of course, official records deny any of this, branding Callus as a traitor, executed on the spot. But fans continue to debate heatedly, convinced the truth is far more intriguing and complex. There's also the haunting case of the lost legionnaires of Epheron. Officially, the Epheron 21st refused orders during a catastrophic warp incursion, resulting in immediate excommunication. But local legends claim the regiment, rather than executed, simply vanished, spirited away by unknown entities rumored to be loyal elements within the Ordo Hereticus. For decades, Epheron survivors were allegedly deployed covertly, fighting threats deemed too sensitive or terrifying for ordinary units. Though these stories border on conspiracy, they highlight something powerful: the fan community's desperate desire to find hope in a universe defined by relentless despair. Fans love speculating that refusal sometimes might secretly be respected by those who see beyond blind obedience. Finally, perhaps the most widely debated and intriguing story revolves around the enigmatic Redemption Company. This mythical unit supposedly formed entirely from regiments that had previously refused suicide missions. Legend has it they operate independently under direct inquisitorial oversight, performing missions considered both too delicate and too dangerous for ordinary Astra Militarum units. Though dismissed officially as absurd, rumors persist, supported by tantalizing hints in unofficial lore snippets and obscure fluff excerpts. Fans obsessively analyze cryptic texts and half-erased administratum records, seeking clues about the Redemption Company's real existence, hoping desperately for proof that defiance can lead not just to survival, but to redemption itself. These legends and stories endure precisely because they offer a tantalizing vision of something nearly impossible within the grim reality of the Imperium: forgiveness and reward for acts of humanity and courage. While official Imperial dogma insists on punishing refusal without exception, fans secretly treasure these whispered tales. They represent an ideal, perhaps naive, perhaps impossible, yet deeply human. They speak to the hope that even within the monstrous gears of imperial bureaucracy and cruelty, there might be room for something genuine, brave, and ultimately noble. The Imperium would deny every word, of course. But fans don't care. In these small whispered stories, humanity's stubborn defiance shines brightest. A quiet rebellion against the unrelenting darkness. When the news spreads across the Imperium that a regiment has refused orders, especially those branded as suicidal, the reaction is rarely straightforward. Official Imperial propaganda always tries to paint these troops as cowardly or treacherous, yet beneath the controlled narratives hidden in whispered conversations and half-glimpsed graffiti on hab-block walls, you find something far more complicated and deeply human. For the civilians of most Imperial worlds, life is brutal, harsh, and defined by sacrifice. They live in sprawling hive cities, agri-settlements, or manufactorums, where suffering and obedience are expected. So, when word trickles down that a regiment has openly refused a suicide order, the first reaction is usually shock or disbelief. Most people have been conditioned from birth to accept that unquestioning obedience to authority, particularly military authority, is a sacred duty. But sometimes, beneath that indoctrination, you can find something else. A quiet, barely admitted sense of admiration. Not openly, of course, never openly, but there's always that whisper in the dark, the quiet nod between exhausted factory workers or weary hab-dwellers. At least someone dared, they murmur to each other when no one else is listening. Fan forums frequently speculate on how families back home feel about such events. Imagine you're the parent, spouse, or sibling of a guardsman sent off-world. knowing deep down that their chance of returning is painfully slim. The Munitorum always sends letters of commendation or condolence, filled with hollow words about honor and sacrifice. But what happens when your regiment, your sons and daughters, say no? Do you feel pride, relief, shame, or all of these at once? In countless fan fiction tales and speculative threads, parents quietly raise a glass in secret to the courage of those who refused pointless death, while simultaneously fearing the repercussions the Imperium might impose on their entire community. These stories strike a nerve precisely because the conflict feels so real, so human, rooted in the genuine anguish of living under a regime that demands everything, yet gives nothing back. Planetary governors often react quite differently. To these ruling elites, a regiment's refusal is not just disobedience, it's a crisis of authority. Governors rely on the Munitorum's favor for political survival, and any sign of disloyalty could bring devastating consequences, including increased tithes or direct intervention by imperial authorities. When the regiment in question originates from their own planet, the reaction is swift and harsh. The governor will usually go to extreme lengths to publicly denounce the troops, labeling them traitors, cowards, or worse. Yet fans love to theorize about governors who secretly admire these soldiers, who privately wish they had the courage to say no themselves. But they know that even the slightest public sympathy would be suicide. Thus, they denounce fiercely, even if privately they mourn their own people. In certain cases, especially when a regiment's refusal becomes known widely enough to reach nearby worlds, small acts of rebellion, carefully concealed but unmistakable, start to appear. You'll find cryptic graffiti praising the regiment's name, whispered conversations between workers in manufactorums, or quiet memorials in the lower decks of hive cities. Even the harshest commissarial patrols can't silence every murmur. Civilians may outwardly accept the Imperium's narrative of treachery, but beneath the surface lies an undercurrent of quiet respect, a faint yet persistent admiration for those who refuse to become just another statistic on the administratum's endless ledgers. Sometimes, however, the propaganda works chillingly well. There are plenty of citizens who fully believe the imperial line, viewing any refusal as outright betrayal. To them, obedience is not merely expected, it's sacred. These citizens often eagerly support the harsh reprisals against regiments labeled rebellious, their fervent patriotism fueled by fear and indoctrination. Fan theories suggest this reaction is deliberately cultivated by the Imperium, a psychological weapon carefully engineered to ensure that civilians themselves help police the loyalty of their own communities. The grim efficiency of this system means that regiments refusing orders rarely become outright heroes. More often, they're isolated examples, warnings rather than role models. Yet, in spite of this, you always find a certain stubborn strain of defiance among ordinary people. For every hive dweller who loudly condemns the traitors, there's another who quietly lights a candle, placing it by a battered photograph of a lost son or daughter. There are hab-block shrines hidden away from watchful eyes, small tokens of defiance and remembrance that serve as silent reminders of those who chose humanity over blind obedience. Fans cherish these images, of mothers quietly weeping but proud, fathers telling hushed stories of bravery instead of cowardice, as small triumphs of humanity against overwhelming oppression. I remember reading one fan account describing an old veteran, a retired guardsman living on some forgotten agri-world, who upon hearing about a regiment's refusal simply nodded slowly, eyes misty, and said quietly, "I wish I'd had the courage to do that." It's stories like these that fans share late into the night, tales of quiet, invisible bravery amidst a galaxy drowning in despair. These narratives don't make it into official Munitorum logs or administratum records, yet they live on precisely because they embody what makes the Astra Militarum soldiers, and their families, truly human. Not their obedience, but their capacity for quiet, secret defiance, the ability to maintain dignity and empathy even under the Imperium's crushing heel. Ultimately, what the civilians of the Imperium think about regiments refusing suicide orders is complex and deeply layered. Publicly, most accept the propaganda, denouncing the troops out of fear or conditioning. Privately, however, many admire their courage, silently wishing for a day when obedience doesn't demand total surrender of one's humanity. In this duality, between public submission and private rebellion, lies a profound truth about life under the Imperium. It reveals a galaxy of people who, even under constant threat of annihilation, quietly cling to the hope that someday, refusing death might mean more than just rebellion. It might mean reclaiming their very souls. When an Astra Militarum Regiment refuses a suicide order, the reaction of the imperial populace is anything but uniform. Despite the best efforts of imperial propaganda, whispers always seep through the cracks, and ordinary people, from the humble hab worker to the powerful planetary governor, can't help but form their own views. Imagine you're just a civilian, toiling away in the factories of some hive world, breathing recycled air, living your life under endless fluorescent lights. You wake up, and the loudspeakers announce yet another glorious victory of the Imperial Guard, another regiment bravely martyred to secure humanity's endless survival. But suddenly gossip spreads through worker cafeterias, maintenance tunnels, and lower hive markets about a regiment that said no. That refused to throw itself pointlessly against impossible odds. That stood their ground, not against aliens or heretics, but against the very orders meant to protect mankind. How do you react? How do you even begin to process that? Some fans imagine that initial reaction might be shock, even horror. Indoctrinated since birth to believe in obedience and sacrifice, your first instinct might be fear. Traitors, you'd whisper with anxious glances around, terrified of who might overhear. But beneath the immediate paranoia, there's another feeling, one that's far more dangerous: curiosity. Why would they refuse? Did they see something we never hear about? Were they simply exhausted from being treated as expendable pieces? Could they have somehow known their orders were flawed or suicidal? Curiosity quickly turns into whispered debates, heated discussions in shadowed corridors, and quiet talks among family members behind tightly shut doors. For families of guardsmen, things become personal, emotional, raw. Imagine the mothers and fathers who lost sons and daughters to heroic sacrifices. Entire lives spent comforting themselves with the belief that their children's deaths meant something. Suddenly, they're confronted by stories of soldiers who refused the same fate. Some families bitterly denounce these soldiers as cowards, unable to accept that perhaps their own loved ones died unnecessarily. Others, however, quietly begin to wonder if their children might have lived had they too been brave enough to refuse. For them, it becomes a painful and secret question. Was their child's sacrifice truly noble, or merely another wasted life among billions? Fan theories suggest that these debates even permeate higher levels of imperial society. Planetary governors, who often live in isolated luxury, distant from frontline horrors, see such events primarily through the lens of power and politics. Some governors quickly and publicly condemn the refusal as heresy, reinforcing their loyalty and compliance to the imperial creed. Yet others, particularly those whose planets have suffered immense losses for dubious gains, privately express sympathy, recognizing the inherent absurdity of certain suicide missions. These leaders walk a delicate balance, outwardly upholding orthodoxy, but inwardly troubled by the implications of soldiers rejecting what is meant to be absolute authority. There's also the hidden undercurrent of admiration among segments of the population, an admiration that imperial authorities desperately try to suppress. To many citizens, these defiant regiments become folk heroes, symbols of courage not for dying obediently, but for daring to stand up against the merciless machinery of war. Rumors circulate of small secret shrines and hidden memorials built in hab-block basements, honoring the bravery of those who said, "Enough." People whisper their names reverently, telling children secret bedtime stories about guardsmen who chose dignity over blind obedience. Such tales grow quietly, persistently, becoming a form of silent rebellion against the rigid dogma of the Imperium. On some planets, this reverence turns dangerous. Small uprisings, spontaneous riots, brief flashes of violence against local enforcement when citizens learn the regiment has been purged or executed. These incidents are swiftly crushed, erased from official records, but the fact remains: the population has been moved enough to act, to risk everything, simply because a regiment refused to march to its doom. Fans often debate online about how the Imperium itself deals with these civilian responses. Some believe that the ecclesiarchy redoubles its sermons on obedience and sacrifice, sending priests to every street corner, preaching louder and harsher doctrines. Others suggest subtler methods: quiet disappearances, curfews, increased surveillance. Whatever method the Imperium chooses, the aim is always the same: silence the whispers, crush curiosity, and ensure obedience at any cost. Yet despite this oppression, fans argue passionately that hope, no matter how faint, can never truly be extinguished. Refusal becomes more than just a singular event. It becomes a story, a question, a challenge whispered by billions across the stars. Can we ever truly be more than fodder for an endless war? In the end, how the Imperium's populace reacts to a defiant regiment is deeply human. A tangled mess of fear, curiosity, bitterness, hope, and quiet rebellion. It's a reminder that beneath the monstrous oppressive system of the Imperium beats the heart of humanity, fragile, defiant, and forever questioning. Absolutely, here we dive deeper into perhaps the most unsettling side of this whole issue: the way external forces like chaos, Xenos, and other sinister powers exploit these critical moments when an Astra Militarum Regiment dares to refuse suicidal commands. After all, even the bravest acts of defiance don't exist in a vacuum. They're vulnerable, messy moments filled with doubt and fear, moments that darker powers eagerly manipulate. Fan communities have long theorized about what exactly happens when a regiment, driven by sheer desperation or raw courage, says no to their commanders. And it doesn't take much imagination to see how this moment of defiance becomes the perfect opening for the whispers of chaos. Chaos doesn't care about courage or morality. It thrives on doubt, uncertainty, and despair. Imagine the scenario: you're a guardsman, exhausted from countless battles, numb from endless losses, and you've just defied a suicide order. Immediately afterward, you're branded a traitor, isolated, hunted by your own comrades. How easy would it be, fans wonder, for a voice from the shadows to promise salvation, revenge, or even a twisted kind of justice? Chaos gods don't ask you to worship blindly. They simply offer what you're desperately craving: a sense of control, purpose, or at least vengeance against the very system that betrayed you. It's tragically easy for guardsmen, abandoned by the Imperium they once served faithfully, to turn bitter, resentful, and receptive to promises from darker forces. Fans often passionately debate cases from lore, like the infamous Traitor Guard regiments, speculating if their betrayal began not with deliberate malice, but with simple human exhaustion and despair. One of the most heartbreaking theories is that many traitor regiments didn't initially plan to join chaos. They just wanted to survive, to escape certain death. But as their own side condemns them, their humanity becomes weaponized against them. In trying to save themselves, they inadvertently become pawns of far darker forces, slowly corrupted step by step, until nothing remains of their original courage and defiance except bitter memories buried beneath madness. The Xenos factions, too, eagerly exploit these vulnerable moments. The Tau Empire, renowned for their pragmatic propaganda, might present themselves as benevolent saviors offering refuge to abandoned regiments. "Join us, and you'll never be thrown away again," they promise, painting an enticing image of camaraderie, equality, and purpose. The Eldar, enigmatic as ever, could intervene subtly, manipulating circumstances to steer regiments into positions that suit their mysterious goals. Even the brutish orcs, fans amusingly speculate, might indirectly benefit from the disorder caused by insubordination, exploiting weakened imperial defenses in the ensuing chaos. But perhaps the most insidious force of all is the Genestealer cult. Fans passionately argue that these cults are uniquely suited to exploiting such situations precisely because they appear to offer what guardsmen crave most: family, community, unity. A regiment cast aside by the Imperium is ideal prey for Genestealers. Their psychic whispers promise a new sense of belonging, where soldiers become brothers and sisters united not by blind obedience, but by something deeper: biological unity, a terrifying parody of family bonds. Many fan theories circulate about regiments who thought they were escaping oppressive commands, only to realize too late that their freedom was an illusion hiding monstrous truths. But can refusal of a suicidal order ever remain pure? Fans debate this endlessly. Some argue passionately that true defiance, grounded in genuine principle, will never be swayed by chaos or alien manipulation. These regiments, they insist, aren't traitors. They're the purest form of loyalty. Loyalty to humanity, not to a broken, heartless bureaucratic machine. Others counter bitterly, asserting that no defiance can ever remain clean. In the grim darkness of the far future, the line between heroic rebellion and catastrophic betrayal is terrifyingly thin. There's a haunting fan-created legend that encapsulates this debate perfectly. The tale of the lost regiment of Callus. Refusing a hopeless assault, they initially stood proud, demanding justice and reason. But as isolation and persecution wore them down, whispers began, subtle temptations promising revenge, justice, or simple survival. Gradually, their righteous defiance curdled into bitter hatred, and before long, the regiment was unrecognizably corrupted, plunging their world into bloody civil war. Whether true or myth, the story vividly illustrates how tragically easy it is for noble defiance to slip into devastating treachery. The heart of fan discussions around this topic revolves around a haunting question. Can refusing a suicidal order ever be purely good, or will it inevitably open doors to darker influences? Perhaps the most terrifying truth fans grapple with is that in the endless war of Warhammer 40,000, even the bravest moral stands rarely remain untouched by shadow. Yet, despite this bleak realization, fans also fiercely argue for hope. The hope that sometimes, just sometimes, defiance can remain noble and free from corruption, serving as a reminder of humanity's ability to resist even the darkest temptations. Ultimately, it's not just about whether these external forces can exploit such moments. They absolutely can and will. It's about whether humanity, even at its most desperate and vulnerable, can find enough strength, enough clarity, to refuse not just suicidal commands, but also the seductive promises of chaos and Xenos alike. The struggle, fans conclude passionately, isn't just physical, it's spiritual, emotional, existential. And in that struggle lies both humanity's greatest danger and its most profound potential for true heroism. Absolutely, this is where things get even darker and stranger. Let's talk about Imperial propaganda, because this is perhaps the Imperium's most insidious weapon. Not bolters or tanks, but carefully crafted lies. Fans know very well that the Imperium survives not just through sheer force, but through tightly controlled narratives and unending misinformation. When an Astra Militarum Regiment dares to refuse a suicidal order, Imperial propaganda swiftly and mercilessly erases them from history. So how does this twisted storytelling machine actually operate? Imagine you're an ordinary Imperial citizen, reliant entirely on official news channels controlled by the ecclesiarchy and the administratum. Every broadcast, every newsfeed, every sanctioned story reinforces a single, unbreakable truth. Obedience is virtue, sacrifice is honor, and questioning is heresy. Now picture news suddenly breaks, briefly, almost accidentally, of a regiment that disobeyed direct commands. How would Imperial media spin such an explosive event? Fan communities passionately theorize that the propaganda apparatus doesn't merely lie, it completely reshapes reality itself, until the regiment never existed at all. The initial step is always simple denial. If word leaks out, the Imperial machine first responds by dismissing rumors as baseless heresy or enemy misinformation. Citizens whisper nervously about what they've heard, but official broadcasts remain silent or aggressively deny the story. This silence itself is terrifying. It sends a clear message to civilians. Asking questions invites suspicion, and suspicion invites punishment. Many citizens immediately suppress their curiosity, not because they believe the lies, but because they're terrified of the consequences of doubt. Next, Imperial propaganda pivots to rewriting history. Entire regiments vanish overnight, not just physically, but from every record, every document, every sanctioned database. Fans passionately argue about how disturbingly thorough this process is. Imagine whole families desperately searching for loved ones who served in the regiment, only to find no official record of their existence. Their names vanish from honor rolls, regimental banners are burned quietly, and even birth records and recruitment archives mysteriously disappear. It's as if thousands of human beings never lived, fought, or struggled. They simply cease to exist. To maintain this elaborate deception, Imperial authorities quickly fabricate new narratives to explain away the gap. One of the most chilling fan theories describes how officials claim the regiment was wiped out heroically, martyred while defending humanity against impossible odds, exactly the fate they refused. Propaganda specialists craft elaborate, stirring tales of sacrifice, honor, and heroism, complete with dramatic speeches, heroic last stands, and manufactured evidence. To the average citizen, these stories are heartbreaking and inspiring, completely masking the brutal truth beneath a comforting lie. Other theories propose even darker methods. Some fans speculate that imperial propagandists label the regiment as traitors or heretics, who secretly plotted against humanity all along. By turning them into villains, propaganda effortlessly transforms defiance into an example of corruption and betrayal. Citizens, conditioned from birth to fear and hate traitors, accept this narrative without question. They gladly denounce neighbors, friends, even family members rumored to sympathize with these traitors. Through fear and paranoia, imperial propaganda doesn't just erase the regiment, it also crushes any hope of meaningful resistance among civilians. Fans also discuss the role of commissars and ecclesiarchy priests in this horrific narrative manipulation. These figures tirelessly preach the correct interpretation of events, reinforcing obedience as humanity's highest virtue. Sermons thunder through loudspeakers, denouncing traitors and celebrating obedience even in death. Propaganda posters appear overnight, displaying heroic guardsmen proudly marching toward certain doom, eyes gleaming with fanatical devotion. Death in service is the highest honor, they declare, drowning out any lingering doubts about the vanished regiment. But there's an even more chilling aspect fans love to debate: self-censorship among the population. Imperial propaganda is so pervasive, so deeply embedded into everyday life, that citizens unconsciously erase inconvenient truths themselves. Parents refuse to acknowledge their lost children's defiance, quietly accepting official lies rather than face painful realities. Veterans who remember the truth are quickly silenced, not always by force, but often by their own sense of shame or fear. The propaganda doesn't just rewrite history. It rewrites the minds and hearts of billions, turning citizens into willing accomplices in the Imperium's crimes. Yet fans passionately argue there's always resistance, even if it's invisible and silent. Tiny acts of defiance persist, hidden among quiet conversations, concealed memorials, whispered bedtime stories passed secretly from parent to child. These moments might seem insignificant, yet they preserve fragments of truth, echoes of genuine courage, defiance, and humanity. Imperial propaganda can silence voices, erase records, and twist memories, but as fans fiercely assert, it can't destroy truth entirely. Ultimately, imperial propaganda's power lies not merely in deception, but in its ability to make citizens complicit in their own oppression. It turns defiant regiments into ghosts, memories into heresy, and questions into crimes. Yet beneath this suffocating darkness, fans passionately cling to the hope that truth, no matter how brutally suppressed, survives somewhere, waiting silently, defiantly, for the chance to be told again. So here we are at the end of this grim but fascinating journey, facing the ultimate question: when an Astra Militarum Regiment refuses a suicidal order, is it an act of heroism, of heresy, or simply another way to perish in this merciless universe? There's no easy answer here, and fan communities have debated this endlessly, passionately, almost obsessively, with opinions as varied and intense as the battles themselves. If we look deep within ourselves, fans of Warhammer, lovers of this brutal yet strangely beautiful lore, we find ourselves grappling with something intensely human. Because at the heart of this question is a choice: obedience or defiance, loyalty or courage, blind faith or conscious resistance. What could be more deeply human than facing impossible odds and daring to ask, why? Some fans passionately argue that these regiments are nothing less than true heroes, perhaps even braver than those who obediently march into death. Because true courage, they say, isn't just about charging fearlessly at the enemy. It's standing firm against your own side when you know deep down that they are wrong. To refuse a suicidal order isn't mere cowardice or weakness. It's a desperate, defiant cry for dignity. It's about reclaiming the right to exist as more than just expendable resources. How many among us, they ask passionately, would have the sheer guts to stand against an entire galaxy-spanning empire, fully aware that your defiance likely means death, disgrace, or even eternal damnation? Yet other fans fiercely counter that refusal is inherently dangerous, a step towards ruin and betrayal. They point out the devastating consequences when discipline breaks down, how quickly confusion spreads, how easily chaos or Xeno's exploitation follows. Heroism, they argue, lies in accepting your grim duty, even when it means certain death, because every act of defiance weakens the Imperium's fragile grip against the horrors waiting just beyond the darkness. To them, obedience, even unto death, is the only shield humanity truly has against complete collapse. They remind us that in the universe of Warhammer 40,000, there's rarely a clean line between bravery and betrayal. Still others, perhaps most poignantly, argue that refusal isn't bravery or heresy. It's simply another tragic way for humans to die in a universe that consumes life endlessly, relentlessly. Whether through obedience or rebellion, death claims all eventually. These fans believe that defiance changes nothing, ultimately serving only to highlight the unbearable cruelty and senselessness of existence in the 41st millennium. It's an act born not from heroism or treason, but from exhaustion, despair, and the simple, aching human desire for survival, meaning, or even just recognition. And perhaps that's the truest and most painful realization we face when discussing this topic. In the grim darkness of the far future, even the bravest and noblest actions are often futile. Yet strangely, this futility doesn't diminish the power or importance of the act itself. Maybe the value of refusal doesn't lie in changing the galaxy or overthrowing tyranny. Maybe it simply lies in reminding us, even briefly, that humanity is still capable of defiance, courage, and dignity, no matter how overwhelming the darkness around us grows. Fan debates around this topic frequently spiral into profound emotional territory. Discussions about free will, sacrifice, the value of a single human life versus the vastness of the Imperium. These conversations aren't just idle speculation. They reflect our own struggles, fears, and hopes about morality, authority, and what it truly means to be human. They remind us, powerfully, that even in a fictional universe of unimaginable brutality, our hearts still yearn for justice, compassion, and dignity. So my fellow fans, after exploring every angle, imperial discipline, propaganda, the desperate plight of soldiers, and even the subtle manipulations of chaos and Xenos, what do you think? Is refusal an act of courage that inspires silent rebellion and quiet heroism among billions? Or is it a dangerous heresy that fractures unity and threatens humanity's fragile existence? Or maybe, just maybe, is it simply one more tragic choice among countless tragic choices in a universe that doesn't care about heroism or rebellion? Whatever your stance, I encourage you passionately. Join the discussion, share your theories, your emotions, your doubts. Let's continue to explore these uncomfortable, haunting questions, because they help us understand not just the grim darkness of Warhammer 40,000, but also our own humanity, struggling bravely against impossible odds. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us. Together, let's delve deeper into the mysteries and stories that make Warhammer such a compelling reflection of our darkest fears and brightest hopes. Leave your thoughts, your theories, your passionate debates in the comments below. Because as long as we're still talking, still questioning, still feeling deeply about these stories, then no act of courage or defiance, however doomed, is ever truly forgotten.